Welcome back to Breaking the Consensus here on Family and Life. We are delighted today to welcome a stalwart of Irish politics and a great defender of life in Ireland, Deputy Éamon Ó Cuiv. Deputy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So, Deputy, we'll crack on.
Call me Éamon now.
Okay, Éamon, thank you. When was your first experience of electoral politics?
Well, I first did the election in 1985. I was always interested in politics. Obviously, politics were discussed at home when I was growing up, but I never really consistently got involved in politics until I went to Cardamona, and I was working as a manager in a small little community cooperative. And the idea of it was to create employment and to improve particularly the farming, but we branched out into creating industry and so on, and providing services. And what we realized was that you couldn't keep people in rural Ireland on farming only. But I was involved in that. And I then joined the local Fianna Fáil Common. I quickly became chairman of the Common and then secretary of what we call the Court of Council, or the area committee. Mm-hmm. And I was involved at that level of politics from the late 70s on. I ran for my first election, was a local election in 1985, and I didn't do very well in the election. I didn't do too much work for it either, and I was a bit of a novice. But I then ran in the general election of 87, did creditably well, particularly taking into account where I live, which is on the Mayo border. And to the south of me, I have Lough Corrib. To the east of me, I have all County Mayo. To the north of me, County Mayo. And to the west of me, the sea. On the isthmus on which I live, within 20 miles of my house, there's only about 1,500 electors. So I was obviously in an area that had very, very sparse population. I then ran in 1989, and I was unlucky. It was the year of the rod licence. I lost votes in my own party, and I still only failed to get elected by 127 votes. But that year, I did make the Senate.
So you're involved. You said at a local level in Common and Cullycanter politics, and then you got in to what the first time you said you didn't do well, but you didn't do much work. Was that maybe a salutary lesson in the nature of Irish politics? That it doesn't matter who you are or where you are.
Well, certainly I wasn't depending on who I was. This was a local election. I was a total novice at the thing. I was very busy in the co-op, and therefore when I say I didn't do too much work, I suppose I put the day job that yes. I was trying to keep this co-op afloat, and that was a difficult job in its own right. And it wasn't an ordinary conventional job. It wasn't a 9-to-5 job by any means. And we were setting up all these businesses. We had an Irish college, we had a store, we had a sheep fattening station. By this stage, we had set up the timber mill, we had machinery out for hire, we had a farm that we had rented and so on. So there were a lot of string to our bow. And this had all started with nothing, just €3,500, little over 11 years before. So we were going places very fast. It was financially precarious, and that was taking a lot of my time as well.
You mentioned that you put the day job ahead of it. That's something I adverted to earlier off here. Am I being fair? But my memory of politics, say in the 70s and 80s, when I would have been a child or teenager and first becoming interested in politics, was you had, there were certain cliches of politics: publicans, teachers, but then auctioneers, solicitors, barristers, shopkeepers, trades unionists, shop stewards. That there was a great variety of people in the Dáil, but not only just variety, but that they were there because they had become interested maybe in a community issue, or they're coming from particular, but they weren't professional politicians. They hadn't decided at the age of 15 they want to be a TE, gone to college and minded themselves. And it seems that across all of the parties, and they're very fine men and women, I'm sure, but there is an element that the new politicians are more professional. And perhaps while they are professional, they have less experience of ordinary life, of the kind of life of their constituents. Or am I being unfair, do you think?
You actually, when you do an analysis of the TDs, that perception of young people who are involved in politics and student politics and then come through the system, some of them might be high profile, but they're very, very scarce in the Dáil. When you look around at the Dáil, an awful lot of people get elected for the first time when they're late 40s, 50s, and some in their 60s. They don't fit in any profile. But what has changed is, if you went back to the 30s to 40s, 50s, being an ordinary backbench TD was a full-time job. Being an ordinary backbench TD was a part-time job.
Right.
And the idea of sittings, as long as we have, would have, wasn't in question. And even when I joined, I got elected the first time, the terms of the Dáil were much shorter. But what has happened is, with the changes in the world, with the huge explosion of bureaucracy and regulation and rules and so on, reality is that not only is being a TD a full-time job, and I mean a full-time job, but being a councillor has become nearly a full-time job. And therefore, when you would look at the amount of paperwork presented to a councillor or TD before the invention of the word processor and the computers and the explosion of, again, there was two explosions here. One was the word, I always say the same paper copier was the first big explosion. You could produce longer documents and then just copies of documents. Then you went into having computers and emails, and that produced another huge explosion and a further lengthening of documents. And then you now have social media and so on, and that's added another layer of constant information coming to you. The other thing that I noticed changed was in 1989, I did have a brick mobile telephone, but that was partly because of the type of work we were doing in the co-op, not so much the political work. That was very rare, but none of my constituents, or very few of them, had a mobile phone. Now everybody who comes into me in the office has a mobile phone, and not only that, but an awful lot of them have smartphones. And you can imagine, therefore, that the amount of emails you're getting, phone calls you're getting, has multiplied. There was a time when I came in here, after 5:30 in the evening, you couldn't contact your local TD. You either had to send them a letter or you had to ring them during the day. They weren't sitting beside the telephone in the offices at 9 or 10 at night, or if there were, people didn't know that. That's all changed. You're expected to be available 24/7. So the nature of politics has changed. And with the exception probably of farmers, one or two that might be engaged part-time in the law library, I would, out of the 160 Chastidala here, I would say the vast majority now are full-time, in terms of that they don't have any other profession or job. And it is because of the time pressures on the job now compared to 30 or 40 years ago, and what's expected of politicians, and the complexity of rules. It is a highly complex job now compared to what it used to be.
The advent, which is a theme of the 20th century, but certainly we say in the last 40 years, we talk about the advent of all these regulations that has transformed the role of the TD. Has that been a fruitful change?
No, like everything else, it's good sides and bad sides. A lot more transparency in certain ways, much slower decision making, and huge ability of people to be obstructive with getting projects off the ground. So there was a time maybe you could get the construction of a road or a pier or whatever going within 4 or 5 years if that was the government decision. Now the same thing could take anything between an absolute minimum of 5, reality probably longer, and could take 20 years, or in the case of the Galway bypass, it's taken us even longer than that. So there is a lot more opportunity for people opposing things. Maybe that's good, but in some cases, a very small minority can obstruct projects that the vast majority want to go ahead.
Elected to the Dáil in 1992, we have seen a huge change in Irish life and culture. Do you think the traditional parties, with Fine Gael, obviously, particularly in the case of Fianna Fáil, understood the cultural changes or politically really were only interested in the budget. It has been said that sometimes one of the reasons of success of the left in Ireland has been because they paid attention to those issues which weren't money bills. Whereas if there wasn't a price attached to it, Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael traditional didn't really care. They weren't.
That's all. I think that all politicians care about all issues. The problem is to try to keep up with everything. I don't know what the left is. To some people, the left is what I would call middle class liberalism.
Right.
To other people, it's about making sure that everybody has shares in the wealth of society, that there's diverse ownership of property, that people have access to good housing and to owning houses, not to just renting houses and so on. And therefore, I find it very difficult when people talk about the left and the right. I just don't fully understand what they're talking about, because I find some people who would see themselves as liberal have been totally intolerant to other views. I've often made the comment that there's nothing as intolerant as a liberal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't say that lightly. And I do a lot of work in the north of Ireland, and I've worked with the DUP. I've worked right across from the people involved in the Republican movement and who are still involved. I'm in and out of the prisons. I deal with them, and we have very rational conversations and very polite conversations. We obviously don't agree. I don't agree with violence as a way of achieving political ends, right across the spectrum to the DUP. Sometimes you find it harder to move the so-called middle ground, than I'd find it to reach some kind of consensus or understanding with the DUP, because at least they're forthcoming with their position. They know that, I'm a Republican, they're a unionist. We agree on that amount, that we're different, and then we move forward. And therefore, I find this left-right definition, nobody seems to want to define it, and I think it has radically changed from what I would have understood as the Connolly left-wingism or the Larkin left-wingism, which was fighting for basic rights for people at the bottom of society. As I said, what people term as left-wingism now is actually very, very comfortable middle-class liberalism.
Mm-hmm. It was always observed, if you're talking about the left and right, and it's an odd thing in Ireland, but it always has been, isn't it? Irish politics has never really, or historically, never fit into the definitions of other polities. You didn't have parties which got the vote of the working class, the vote on another party, the middle class. One party which got young people's votes. There's a well-known book in Irish political science by a Canadian political science called Carty, called Parish Pumping Politics in Ireland, and he makes the observation that Fianna Fáil, especially, but this was true of Labour and of Fine Gael, got a certain number of votes from working class votes. They got a certain number of urban votes, rural votes. That there wasn't either a class or economic breakdown of Irish politics. That the parties.
I wouldn't agree with that.
You wouldn't agree with that.
Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael was not civil war. It was more to do with class.
The men of property.
And that type of philosophy than it was to do with the Civil War. And the reality is that a lot of the people who were involved in Fianna Fáil, even though there were people who had made good, a lot of them came from very, very modest backgrounds. And I remember asking, my wife comes from a small farm in Connemara, which by any terms, in any modern terms, she would have been brought up in relative, if you want to call it, poverty.
Yes.
And I said, when you were young, and I was brought up in the middle class, urban background, and I said to her one day, when you were young, did you think we were poor? And she said, no, we didn't think we were poor because we were all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And all around their area were more or less in the same situation. Most of them were small farmers. Most of them owned their land, owned their houses, which gives you an unusual mix. But in cash terms, they were very, very poor. And I remember her father giving me a great explanation as to why he followed Fianna Fáil. In fact, it was the only time he ever kind of gave me a lecture and corrected me. Was I kind of cast aspersions on Fianna Fáil. This would be in around 1970 or 71, 72. And he knew who I was, obviously, but he still was not pleased that I kind of was knocking Fianna Fáil. But it was very interesting, the reasons he gave for supporting Fianna Fáil. Part of them were national, but the real reason was the huge amount of social progress they made in the 30s, a time that people now see as hardship, but for them, it was a radical change because they introduced work schemes. In fact, I introduced a scheme modeled on this in later times as a minister, work schemes whereby in the winter time they got work off the farms, building bog roads. And what happened then was that Fianna Fáil came into power, introduced a scheme, but one of the big schemes introduced was to create work for the small farmers in the wintertime, doing things that would then be of benefit to these same small farmers during the rest of the year. And one of the things he mentioned was, for example, building bog roads. They got paid a regular wage for this, which was totally new to them, because till then they had depended on their farms. And on the other hand, when the springtime came and they were working on the bog and bringing in the turf, they had the benefit of a new road that had been built. So he explained to me the practical benefits that very, very ordinary people, saw with the Fianna Fáil government as he saw it. It's only 4 years ago since a very good friend of mine, she was in her 80s, died, but she was telling me very shortly before she died, she was the postmistress in Carna, but she told me about going to a big meeting in the 50s in Rosmuck, where Éamon O spoke. And again, I asked her the same question, why did you go, or why did the people go? And she said, he was good for the poor people. So Fianna Fáil, the philosophy, as I understood it to be, was to create wealth, because without wealth, you can't divide anything. And on the other hand, it was to very, very much make sure that that wealth benefited the ordinary people of the country, the vast majority of whom, and in those days, by today's terms, were poor. So we look around Dublin and we see the huge housing policies of the 30s. We see the creation of employment in the state employment and in private employment and so on. And these were tentative efforts, but you were talking about it literally starting from a standing start, because when we look at the relative economies of Northern Ireland and the Republic 1920, you see that the North had all the industry.
Sure.
And the South was poor agrarian. When you compare those 2060, you suddenly see that the whole thing has been reversed. Therefore, the South, as a state, was successful, but particularly in the early years, it was successful in lifting everybody with it. Now, I've often said, if we look at Cuba, there are attractive things in Cuba, but the reality is that most people would be a lot poorer than we say Irish people. I then look at America and I see it in the other extreme, where it's completely based on competition. And they might be richer, but then the difference between rich and poor is much greater. I want to see a society that's much more coherent, that everybody, that's less segregated than modern urban societies are, that's much more integrated. And that's more like the model we see in rural Ireland, where everybody lives in the same community, goes to the same schools, mixes, plays in the same teams. And whether you're in receipt of social welfare or the richest person in the parish, you're part of the same team.
If you're going to try to articulate what you today would regard as the core value of Fianna Fáil, what would you say that is? And do you feel that that core value is being respected by the party today?
Well, I don't think there's one core value to a party, because there's hardly an issue that I don't have a view on.
Right.
And I wouldn't see, as being a view that I try to promote as a Fianna Fáil view. So, for example, I believe in the creation of wealth, but only if you divide the wealth fairly amongst in other words, that everybody gets to share parts of the wealth of the country. I believe in private ownership, but only in as much as that private ownership should be very diverse. Now, when I say diverse, what I mean by this is, do I think that there's an absolute right for one person to own all the houses in the country and then everybody else has to rent off them? That's what I meant to me. Do I think it would be much better if as many people as possible own their own house individually? Yes. So that's what I call diverse ownership. In other words, as many people as possible have a stake in the ownership. But I'm not against, as some, we say, classical left-wing people would be, I'm not against private ownership. I'm not against private enterprise. But I am very strongly in favour of that a small number of people shouldn't control all the wealth. Absolutely anathema to my way of thinking. Then when we look at social issues, I want to create a society where all sections of society live easy with each other. As I said, that is particularly a big challenge in our cities. Mm-hmm. And it's one that nobody wants to address. That the disadvantaged parts of the cities are often unseen by the middle and upper classes in the cities who have no contact with the less affluent areas of the cities. And this is a challenge. Rural Ireland is different in that way, in that they're much more integrated communities.
You have been a prominent supporter of the life issue for your career. Coming up to the referendum, did you have a sense that the Eighth Amendment would be repealed, or did you have any, or were you shocked by the nature and the size of the result?
Well, what was obvious with the Irish Times polls way before the referendum, that you could divide Irish society or Irish opinion on this issue into three sections: those who wanted quite liberal abortion, those who wanted no abortion, and those who were willing to look positively at a case made for the hard cases. Mm-hmm. So in analysing the results of the referendum, you have to take that into account. Now, what seems to me, and in a well-planned campaign by the pro-choice side, the people who are in favour of the referendum, starting with the Citizen Assembly and so on, they worked a very, very clear programme. And basically, they managed to bring that middle third with them on the basis that you couldn't get, for example, very limited abortion, and we see it on the statistics published, fetal abnormalities, and the other very, very serious exceptions, that you couldn't get that without the very liberal abortion. And people wanted to accommodate those, so that third in the middle, in the end, totally went to one side. It could have split, but it didn't split, and they won that particular battle. And they picked their battlegrounds very, very carefully, and having been involved in the campaign, you could see that, we were losing on that ground, that middle third. Now, do I think that the Irish people have changed dramatically from where they were before the referendum? I don't. I think the way the question was binary, and they want to accommodate these two groups, the people who wanted the big exceptions, rape, incest, and fatal abnormalities. And in doing that, the only way of doing that was to accept the whole package. When was it lost? I would have said that, the pro-life side were always probably going to lose, but they probably would have got over 40%. But when the Facebook ads, etc., were closed down, it certainly made a difference to campaign, because after that, everything was mediated through the big media, and therefore they could ask the questions.
I've seen a number of analyses done of a breakdown of opinion reporting and news reporting in the main media outlets in the 4 to 6 weeks before the vote, and the argument has been made that in a dishonourable way, the Irish media ceased being reporters and became advocates, and didn't actually fulfil their function to inform in any real sense, bar a few voices. Do you think that that's a fair critique of the media, or is it just the losers whining because they couldn't make their case?
No, I think media generally nowadays, an awful lot of it is commentary. And of course, the media editors have huge choice, not only have huge control, not only in that issue, but in a lot of other issues. The commentary on Brexit, I thought, was not great. Mm-hmm. European Union is often not great. So the media, despite itself, reflects the class and the social milieu and the social values of the people in the media. That's perfectly understandable, if at times reprehensible.
It's been remarked to me a number that, which seems like a very, very long time ago now, that in a sense, this move towards a rather more monochromatic viewpoint in the media, you can, since the demise of the Irish press, that there has not been, or not that there hasn't been a differentiation within the media, but that was the beginning of this process where we have, the Irish Times essentially has become a journal of advocacy, having previously regarded itself as the organ, shall we say, the paper of record, but they're private institutions. Do you think that RTE still fulfills its function properly as a public broadcaster subvented by the license fee?
Well, it depends what part of RTE we're looking at, but are you talking about RT1 or RT1 radio? If you are, it reflects, as I said, the class that populates the journalism there, and that is to be expected. Not only does it do that in a class way, but it also does it in a geographic way. And I would describe some of the chat programs as, there was a famous long-playing record put out years ago by Michael McLeomore, and the title on it was, "I Must Be Talking to My Friends." And if I look at the panels, for example, of shows on the weekend, I often find that they all come from the same class. Mm-hmm. A lot of them come from around Dublin, etc., etc. I don't get the voices of the kind of people that I see every Saturday. And yet, my clinic in Galway as being consistent players. They would get the odd invitation when there's some issue, but they're not consistent players. But the reality is, and this is where Dublin differs from the rest of the country, I don't think the Irish Times, as an Irish Times newspaper, counts for that much, because when you look at the readership of it, it's declined dramatically.
True.
RT is hugely dominant. There is no question or doubt about that, because a lot of people, for big issues, look at the news there. But at least in rural Ireland, we have the counterbalance of the local radio stations that are much more balanced, and yes, stations read in the Gaeltacht, which is an RT station that I would accept from what I've said, because again, most of the presenters on Radio na Gaeltacht, and the same thing applies to TG Cahir, actually live in rural Ireland and live in the Connemara Gaeltacht.
I just think it's ironic, and maybe it's a cheap shot, that for people who care so passionately about the word diversity, when you're talking about the lived diversity within Ireland, or diversity of opinion, that doesn't seem to be quite so important.
Yes, and as I've said, there's nothing as intolerant of contrarian views as the liberal. And one of the problems here is that if you go to express a different view on anything, on all sorts of subjects of economics, of where Europe is going, people close down the debate. For example, we recently made a big decision in this country to become major contributors to the European Union.
Yes.
There hasn't been much of a debate about that. You would have thought there would be a big debate about that. Europe is becoming much more militarized, and I am pro-life right across the whole spectrum of beliefs, and therefore I'm very much against the power of the big countries in terms of arms production, the big countries being Europe, if you consider it as a unit, but it is very much a central policy of the European Union to produce all of these arms. America, China, Russia, these are the big producers of arms. I'm totally opposed to that arms race. And the wars being fought in the third world are often fought with European, American, Russian, and Chinese armaments. When we then look at issues such as, the interference in the politics by the same states of other regions, and the destabilization, as we've seen in the Middle East, in North Africa, and so on, a lot of it because of actions, of political actions coming from the wealthy regions of the world. I would be totally opposed to that, but we tend not to question that, and we particularly as members of the European Union, tend not to question that in the European Union context.
I've heard it said that one of the differences historically between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael on their relationship with Europe was that Fianna Fáil tended to have what you might call a transactional relationship, that Fianna Fáil wasn't, in a sense, philosophically or religiously committed to the European idea, but rather this was a trade, an opportunity for the economic advancement of the state. Whereas Fine Gael was more, because perhaps it lacked the opportunities for power locally, that the opportunity to be sitting at the high table with the Chancellor of Germany or the President of France was something which was very important to it. But that we have now got to a point, there was perhaps a difference in emphasis, a difference of attitude towards Europe, that today, if we look at the commentary about Brexit, irrespective of what one might think about Brexit, it was very much coming from a position that Brexit was obviously wrong, obviously stupid, rooted in...
Why is it obviously wrong and obviously stupid?
No, I'm saying that was if you read the Irish media commentary, you read Fintan O'Toole, not only was it wrong, but it was also, it was kind of low. It was based on some kind of a xenophobic or racist impulse or a Little Englander thing. There was very little sense given that maybe this was the British people in their own way recovering a degree of sovereignty or simply asserting their right. You know, people have the right to organize themselves in the way that they see fit. There was incredibly little nuance in the reporting. We seem to have got to a point where Europe is just a good in and of itself. And we don't seem to interrogate it much. And if you do interrogate it, you're just pushed into the group, oh, you're one of those people, you know?
Well, my view was, first of all, it was a democratic decision. And if the results had gone the other way, it would have been seen as final then, by the same groups who gave out about the results when it didn't go their way. The second thing is, we will not know what form Brexit takes for another 5 or 7 years. But let's presume that Britain maintains good environmental standards, remains good social protections for its workers. Let's presume that Britain gets a very, very good trade deal with Europe. And on the other hand, is free to follow its own policies in other realms of society, isn't subject to a non-elected European court and European institutions. They might be able to be more nimble in making sure the laws suit the people than, we'll say, for example, Ireland. Now, we just don't know how Brexit is going to work out. But the signs at the moment are that they will get some kind of a very good trade deal, which was one of the big arguments put against it. And we're not sure in the longer term whether Britain, who had set a lot of the standards for Europe, a lot of European standards were based on British standards initially. We're not sure that there's going to be a race to the bottom in Britain. And certainly I would imagine if there was against workers, that the Labour Party would quickly come to the fore and get elected as government. Indeed. So one of the interesting questions is, will history say that it was bad for Labour, bad for trade, or will it say actually it was good, but it also handed back sovereignty? Because one of the problems I face, because I'm in an area where European rules have huge implications for us. For example, all these special areas of conservation, about 80% of the Connemara and Arden Islands are designated, and the other 20% are so near the designated areas that it effectively has 100% impact. And you get situations because of European legislation that somebody who wanted to add an extension to their house couldn't do it because it would impact on the SAC, even though it was only the size of, I think, 2 rooms. So, and we can't change that law. That is it. I frequently come across European laws that create difficulties. I came across one yesterday, and if I told you the circumstances of it, I think you would agree with me. It is utterly bizarre, but the reason I was given that the transaction was so difficult is because of European law. And the problem with European law, if we get a law, which we often do, all lawmakers can make mistakes. All laws have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
If you do that here in the Oireachtas, you can go back and change it. But you can't, in practice, change any European law because it has an unintended consequence somewhere in Ireland. You can't get it changed on that basis. And this is a challenge debated. We haven't had a proper debate about, subsidiarity in Europe. Even if we accept that we want to stay in the European Union, and I accept that that's what the vast majority want to do, we haven't had a debate of what that shape of the Europe going forward. But to answer your question about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, I think Fianna Fáil were philosophically committed to cooperation between nations, and that goes back to the 30s.
League of Nations.
What we didn't want is a European government, and that we were basically only a glorified home rule situation. And I think that's the difference.
There was a lot of talk about how it would be bad for Britain. Very little talk about the fact that an EU without Britain might be bad for Ireland. People have not, I think, realised that how often Britain was our closest ally, and very often we were able to stand behind Britain on issues. Do you think that that the EU is going to be a slightly colder place for Ireland now, with the British gone?
The difficulties of Brexit for us are ginormous. There's no question about that. And what we needed to play from the beginning was that we needed Europe and we needed Britain. And it wasn't one or the other, and that we didn't want to make a chase between one or the other. Because, for example, if we look at our, there's one very simple thing that would be familiar to me. If we look at our beef export, it's about the vast majority of our beef goes to Europe, but about 50% of that goes to Britain.
Yes.
So they're equally important. The British market without the European market is no good to us. The European market without the British market is no good to us. And in so many facets of our life, it's the same way, whether it's business, socially, or so on. So the one thing we did stand up for was the common travel area, that we want to common travel with both Britain and Europe. And we seem to have achieved that because it wasn't one or the other. Common travel with Britain without common travel with Europe wasn't attractive, but more so common travel with Europe without a common travel area, not only with Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland, but with Britain was also not possible. I also think that in the debate, and it was interesting, John Hume died this week. And lots of people have been praising John Hume, and I will praise John Hume. Mm-hmm. I didn't always agree with him, but I did agree with a lot of what he did. And I think he was a towering personality in Irish politics for a long, long time. But the amazing thing is, when we look back at the history of the last 4 years, Irish nationalism, North and South, were intolerant of a legitimately held view by a large section of unionism in Northern Ireland, that Britain was more important to them than Europe. Mm-hmm. Whereas we were obviously articulating North and South as nationalists, that Europe was more important than Britain. And my view was, and I had a lot of debates with members of the DUP, and I had contacts also over in Westminster, my attitude was quite simple. And that is that we couldn't have a border on the Irish border, that was not going to work. And I think most DUP members accepted that in reality. But that it was also hard for a unionist to accept a hard border in the Irish Sea, and that whatever solution we would arrive at had to get round what seemed an impossible circle to square. We just ridiculed the unionist position for a long, long time. And from contacts I have, there was very, very little tic-tacking between the government down here and the DUP element in Northern Ireland who were pro-Brexit. And their situation was publicly ridiculed. Now, the situation was, as far as I was concerned, we couldn't have a border on the Irish border, but I could also recognise that the unionists didn't want a border and have it sucked to them that there was a border in the Irish Sea and that they were part of the European Union single market and they were part of the European Union customs union. And it was only at the very last minute that I think the Irish government and the British government realised that there was a two-way problem. The British government had to recognise there could be no border on the Irish border. That was out of the question. But on the other hand, the Irish government had to recognise that Northern Ireland was a divided society with two communities. The pro-Brexit one was in a slight minority, but we have argued in the past that that's not a reason that the minority should be ignored. And they came up with a unique solution that I actually don't think that even the unions themselves realised at the time was going to be so beneficial for them. And I'm not sure how many people down here realise that in the end of the day, the Northern Ireland unionists might have won the day on economic fronts. And I'll just give you two examples. Northern Ireland, under the present arrangement, is going to be the only part of the sterling area that's in the single market area as well.
Right.
So if you're doing sterling transactions and you want a sub-office and you place it in Belfast or Derry or Newry, you're in the sterling area, but you're also in the single European market for regulation purposes, which could be for financial companies quite a bit of an advantage. Now, they have an even better arrangement if you're making widgets. You know the famous mythology.
Yes.
If you're producing goods, the situation is that if you produce them down here, and if there isn't free trade between Ireland and Britain, let's take the doomsday scenario, then when you export those goods to the European Union, what's going to happen is that you're going to pay a tariff. However, if those goods are produced in Northern Ireland, you won't pay a tariff.
Right.
On the other hand, if we produce goods down here and we want to sell to the rest of the European Union, we won't pay a tariff, obviously, we are in the Union. But goods produced in Northern Ireland, as long as they export them through the Republic of Ireland and into the rest of Europe, will also go into Europe tariff-free. In other words, they have a two-way bet.
A nice deal.
Now, if we look at another interesting scenario that arises out of this, and that is if you get citizenship of France or Germany or any other European country other than Ireland, what your situation is going to be is that you will be able to work and live in any country of the European Union. If you get citizenship of Britain post-Brexit, you'll be able to work and live anywhere in Britain and Ireland. If you get citizenship of this state, of Ireland, you will be able to work and live anywhere in Britain, Ireland, and the rest of Europe. Our citizenship is going to be the premier citizenship in Europe to get.
Very good. You mentioned the sad passing of John Hume, and I just wondered if we might just take a moment there. You said that at times you disagreed with him. There's been an interesting discussion. Everybody every reasonable person, I think, recognizes he was a man of enormous moral integrity, also courage, moral and physical courage, to be committed to the principle of consent and non-violence in the 1970s and 80s was not always an easy position to be in. But there was a sense that by bringing in the physical force tradition into the thing, that inevitably, or do you think, was it inevitable that that the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP would end up being, in a sense, squeezed or crushed between the two parties on the extremes when it became an auction between two competing communities? They would always go to the extreme bid and the people in the middle would lose out. And
well, it's not really what happened. In that, one of the things that has happened in politics in the North, and it's happening in the politics down here, that as parties grow, they tend to move into the middle because they want to keep their electorate, because the electorate doesn't change that much. You see, people don't change as much as, commentary would tell you. Oh, the Irish people are totally changed from what they were 40, 50, 60 years ago. They are and they aren't. Mm-hmm. Technology changes, circumstances changes, but the ordinary people, when you meet them and sit down with them, as I do every week, aren't as changed as people make them out to be. So the reality is, and I predicted this with the DUP way back, that as the DUP grew, it would grow into the middle. And when it got to the point that it represented the majority of unionism, it obviously was a very different party than the party that Ian Paisley had originally founded. And he was very, very mellow by the end of his career, and I knew him quite well. And similarly, with the Sinn Féin position, if you watch them north to south, they espouse the institutions of this state and they espouse the institutions of the northern state. They are socially and economically moving into the middle. They have joined the liberal middle classes in terms of their social values and the so-called social issues. Mm-hmm. So in the end of the day, maybe the labels have changed, but I'm not sure that it's changed that much. Now, it wasn't to the good of the SDLP, but remember one thing about John Hume. He was never a party operator, if you want to call that, or driven by the development of a party in the way that lots of other politicians were. And for example, the founders of Fianna Fáil would have seen the party had been very important to sell the message. I think all of the commentary on John Hume would say that he was quite a loner in those terms, and that he wouldn't have devoted much time to the SDLP in the conventional sense that we say Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael would have done down here to promoting the party, or that Sinn Féin is doing incredibly successfully at the moment. And we sometimes conflate in the Sinn Féin situation their policy, which has shifted hugely into the middle, and we're working with them in committees every day. We know the detail of their policy. And on the other hand, the organisation of it as a party that is still very tight and it is still very, very effective and organised.
Yeah, it has, obviously, it has had to change. It has had to evolve, go on a journey.
Yeah, go on.
We all go on journeys these days. This is the thing that we do. But is it yet a normal party? In the sense, I think a lot of people were shocked and quite annoyed. I was surprised, in fact, just in ordinary conversations with friends of mine and stuff, about the incident of the funeral of the prominent Republican in Belfast, that there was a sense that this was not it was a rather arrogant action, but more to the point that the leader of both North and South went because this was something they had to do, that this was not, that had this been another political party, they would have made a great show of not going, in a sense. They would have done everything at distance and socially distanced and on TV and whatever.
But leaders of state went to John Hume's funeral.
They did.
And people turned out in the street. They didn't in big numbers because the family asked them not to. But, I think that incident has been magnified hugely. Reality is that a large number of people apparently turned out to watch the funeral go by. Now, I happen to have been in that part of Belfast during the week. And when I came back to collect my car, the person who was with me, who knew Belfast well, said to me, by the way, do you see that house that was parked outside? That's Bobby Story's house. So it's right in the middle of Andersonstown.
Right.
And therefore, if people turned out and started lining the streets, very hard situation to control. My understanding is that in the church, there was strict social distancing and that there was only a very small number of people. Now, I think what the Humes did was very noble in telling people to keep away. But certainly I have been at rural funerals. Now, they wouldn't have had the numbers that the Bobby Story funeral had, of course not. But I was at a funeral recently, and there was a large number of people lining the road in a line. And if you looked at the photograph at the right angle, we probably would have looked to be closer together than we were.
Yes. And it's very easy to take a photograph that tells the story you wanted to.
Therefore, you know, I don't know what happened there. I don't know how much the people turned out spontaneously or how much it was organized. And I think it's foolish judgment in a situation like that.
Sorry, just on this subject, I hadn't, it's just come up. I want, if you have an opinion on it, if not, it doesn't matter. You live in a very rural part of the world, on the border, you were saying, between Mayo and Galway. Very beautiful part of the world. Do you think it makes sense at this stage in the pandemic in Ireland to have the same rules applying to a village in Roscommon or a village in Wexford where you have 200 people in a small pub which has very few people in it, where you have no cases for the last 3 weeks, where the effective chances of infection are very, very, very low indeed, that this should be treated in the same way as Temple Bar or Dame Lane?
Well, that's a very complex question, and if we had 2 hours, we could discuss it. Reality is, for example, I do live in a beautiful part of the world, but most of the calls I've been getting since the pandemic started, in places like West Connemara, Clifton, etc., is how do we control the crowds? Mm-hmm. How do we stop thousands of people from Dublin, where they perceive there's a high level of infection, and there is 4 times the level of infection per 100,000 people in Dublin than there is in the west of Ireland. How do we stop them all coming down and crowding in, breaking the social distance and spreading the disease to the local people? Similarly, a lot of businesses in the Aran Islands haven't opened, and you might have seen that there was a huge debate within the islands themselves, with a lot of islanders not wanting to open at all this year, because again, they didn't want thousands and thousands of people landing on their shores, and inevitably, statistically, increasing the risk of bringing the disease in. So it's not easy to do it geographically, because, you know, 3.5 hours from now, you can be in Connemara and you can spend 2 weeks in your holidays there, or a week in the holidays there, or go for a weekend. So if you opened up pubs, I'm not sure that they all remain that quiet, and certainly there are large parts of my constituency, and some of them the most remote, but the nearest the coast, that would be heavily populated in a situation like that. So it's a very, very difficult call.
It is a difficult, but we from the statistics we see at the moment, that Galway, Kerry and Wexford are the 3 most popular destinations for people holidaying. I'm in North Wexford here. This has long been a holiday destination for people from South Dublin. And I can tell you, last weekend we had, it was as busy a August bank holiday as I've seen on the beaches for a very long time. And we'll see now, and hopefully we won't see in a couple of weeks' time an increase. But have we reached the point where we have an exaggerated sense of the risk, or rather that we haven't got a balanced sense that there are risks in not opening up also, that the social and economic problems that are hidden by this aren't being sufficiently taken into account?
There are huge risks in any path you take in this pandemic. The other thing that's becoming obvious, outdoor activity is very, very low risk compared to anything indoors.
Yes.
Argument against if we take the Wexford situation, you say you're North Wexford, a large people number of the beaches, small enough risk, and people don't tend to sit, other than in family clusters, within 2 meters of each other on an Irish beach, because there's all space. The problem is, if you opened up the pubs, would they then adjourn from the beach on the wet days or in the evening time and crowd into your pub? And if it's a standing situation, it's much harder to control than sitting down having a meal, and that's what the meal issue arose. Now, there's no black and white and no simple rules here. But
sorry, just to come across it, standing issue was the issue, was it? Standing issue.
Well, it's controlling people in confined spaces,
right,
over longer periods of time is the problem. We know that from the very beginning. So if you're at a meeting with a small number of people and they're all fixed 2 and 2.5 meters apart, and as in the Dáil, when the bell rings, it stops and so on, you can control the disease. The place you have to control it then is in the socialization when we go and get the tea and so on. But in that kind of situation, you would hope that the politicians would be relatively responsible and so on. But let's be honest about it. If you had a bubble and a whole lot of people came in, you'd have to have very, very strong regulation. In fact, to be quite honest, the only thing that would be practical is that there'd be table service only, and that there'd be no standing and no sitting at the bar. Otherwise, your job, if you were the gatekeeper trying to keep people from abusing social distance, would be totally impossible. So this is complex stuff. And the reason behind it is not necessarily the open air event. It can be the consequence of that when people move indoors. So for example, the argument now, I was very disappointed personally, because in the parish now which I live, championships have happened, and this is replicated all over Ireland. And people tend to go in their cars to football matches. There isn't a huge congregating in eateries and whatever afterwards, and people tend to go home. And we're confined to 200 people, including the players. And in the GA team, you've 60 probably gone before you even get to the stewards.
Yes.
You're probably 100 between two teams, which is 50 supporters per team.
Yeah, we have our club championship is on at the moment. It's being held in a squeezed place. And
the pitches themselves could accommodate a huge number of people. However, where the challenge arises is if the people went back to the local hostelries or gathered informally outside of the grounds. You can keep it controlled in the grounds. That's what the argument is. It's a difficult argument. In some places, it seems very penal. In other places, depending on social habits, there might be good validity for it.
Well, I look at Wexford Park as a capacity of 20,000. Most people, in my experience, when you go to a match, people go in families or in pods. So in Wexford Park, there would be you could have an entrance on one side of the park and the exit on the other side of the park. You could make it a one-way system. That could easily be in. But having just a couple of hundred people at a championship match, potentially a county final, when the risks, as you say, for outdoor events, and these are really important events. Maybe perhaps that's not understood how important these events are in the life, particularly of a small parish. I think it's unfortunate. I think that certainly could have been done without any great.
Well, yeah, maybe so or maybe not. But if you go to Northern Ireland, there are certain hostelries around. Croke Park would be jammers beforehand and jammers
absolutely,
after.
Yes.
And
hostelries.
The hostelries, but the problem, what the argument against allowing, say, 1,000 people or 2,000 people into Wexford Park, is that the park, and within the park, you get a stewarded properly, it'll be no problem. But would a large number, maybe 500 people, adjourn to hostelries or other places they could socialise afterwards after the match? Now, it wouldn't be my habit after a match, but there are people who do it, and obviously we have to, I think there has been a risk assessment done here. It is difficult, and as I said, I don't think it was an easy call, but I do understand that argument as well, as I understand the argument, that a lot of people are making to me. Can you not allow us have 400 or 500 people at these local club matches? And, I think what we really need to see is if we can get control of this again, and if we're satisfied that people understand they must take personal responsibility, I think we can move forward. And in fact, my view was that the previous government moved forward when they started bringing the dates forward dramatically. They sent a signal out there, an invisible signal, but a signal nonetheless. We've cracked this, we're on top of it. You can all relax. And they did it too fast. I actually think if they stuck to their original time scale, the ironic part of it is we might be able to have 500 matches because I think people did drop their guard. I think everybody has to admit to drop the guard a bit at different levels. The very, 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 very careful, dropped it a little bit. To the very, very not so careful, dropped it even more. But I think what actually would get the message across, this disease is still there. We still need, in every action you to take good care. And it's not that. And that is the problem. It wasn't so much about the physical this and the physical that. It was the impact it has on people's private behaviour.
Before we finish up, I'd like just to have a quick word about the language. You're a well-known advocate for the language. Now, you yourself, you're born and brought up in South Dublin. No, admittedly, the son of a great Irish scholar. Do you think that we need to change the way we think about the language and start to recognise that the largest Irish-speaking town in Ireland is Dublin? And not to say that we give up on the Gaeltacht, but not to regard the future of the language as necessarily being solely based or contingent on the existence of the Gaeltacht.
Well, I've had this debate from the first time I got involved in Irish language politics, which was well before ordinary politics, because I was very involved in the Irish language movement when I was in university. And the reality is, if it hadn't been for the revival movement, which was driven from outside the Gaeltacht, there would be no Gaeltacht in Ireland today. So one cannot survive without the other. I come, as you know, from the revival tradition. In other words, 3 of my 4 grandparents were involved in the movement. 2 of them are well known, Éamon de Valera and Sinead de Valera, but the involvement of Éamon Ó Cuiv right throughout his life in the Irish language movement. He was the person, for example, that suggested setting up the first Irish college, which was set up in Ballingeary in 1904. And he was involved in that into the 30s. So I come from a revivalist tradition, but one that understood the importance of the Gaeltacht, where the language is still the language of public meetings, of masses, of personal conduct of business and so on. When I do my clinic in Mam Cross, the people from West Connemara, which is non-Gaeltacht, all come in talking English, and the people from South Connemara do their business, whether it's medical cards, planning permissions, housing application or whatever, do their total business in Irish. And therefore the Gaeltacht is important. It's a wellspring of the language and the language well spoken. But you're absolutely right, the Gaeltacht would not survive for 5 minutes without it being a national policy and without all of those Gaeltachts who live outside of the city, some of whom came from the Gaeltacht and others who, like myself, went the other way, and some who remain all their lives in Dublin, but habitually speak the Irish language. So we need all Irish speakers, wherever they are, wherever in the globe that they live. We need them all, and dividing people is always a bad idea. And the number of Irish speakers is small enough. There's about, 90,000 daily Irish speakers in the Republic, and there'll be some in the north, and obviously some spread throughout the world. We need them all, and we should have an inclusive approach to the language, not an exclusive approach. But to say that the language would survive in the same way without the Gaeltacht, I think is wrong. To say that the Gaeltacht would survive without the language being important throughout this country and to most Irish people at home and abroad would also be wrong. And just to give you one simple example, can you imagine the Gaeltacht without the Irish colleges?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Example, symbiosis between the Gaeltacht and the non-Gaeltacht.
The likes of myself and my friends going down to Brunacroig and Dingle and Ventry and having a wonderful, wonderful experience learning our career. This is a question I've pondered, and maybe it's silly or naive, but I believe now we're the OECD country with the highest percentage of our population which is not native born. We have transformed from being a country where we went away to a country where people come to live here. So we have a degree of ethnic national diversity, which even 30 years ago would have seemed incredible. Are we missing a trick, perhaps, in a sense, that we could see the language in the same way as Gaelic games have functioned, as an opportunity for helping people to share in an identity that all these different people from different places across the world, whose parents came from different places, and Irish people who are here for generations, and I suppose say the new Irish, but rather the language, rather than being a point of division, can be a point of coherence, of congruence, of unity, where we can come in, where it doesn't matter where you're from or what you look, that if you kick a football and you speak the Hopla Focal, that this is Irishness. You're participating in it.
Interestingly enough, when Father Micheál McGrain did the huge study on social attitudes in Ireland, he found that the attitudes amongst immigrants towards the Irish language was more or less the same as society in general. And society in general was very favourably disposed towards the Irish language. Now, one thing the immigrants tend to bring with them is a much greater acceptance of being multilingual, or bilingual and multilingual, than we do. People, in the English language speaking countries tend to think that's an amazing thing to speak two languages. Of course, the most multilingual people I've ever met are Africans, who tend to have 3 or 4 languages because they have 1 or 2 of the native African languages. They inevitably had some dominant European language that was fairly pervasive in their countries, whether it was English or French or in other places Portuguese. And then, so, their ability in languages puts us to shame, and they have a great acceptance of languages as being the norm, of multilingualism being the norm, where we as a people have a big, big difficulty with that generally.
Before we close up, and this is my last question, and one question I ask politicians on this format, because it's a question that comes up a lot in my own work, is as we go forward with on the life issue, whether it's abortion or whether a lot of people are fairly convinced that there's a euthanasia bill coming our way fairly soon, people want to understand what is the most effective way for the citizen to try to lobby their local councillors, the local TDs. How do you go about talking to people? What's the best and most effective way of getting your point across?
Well, lots of groups think, particularly environmentalists, that sending thousands and thousands of emails all saying the same thing is persuasive. I think most politicians would say it's a damn nuisance, and all you do is get very effective with the delete button because you just can't handle it, and because they're all the same thing. And you don't know who's originating and where the thought is, so you can't enter a debate. And what politicians always want to do is engage with an issue, not to get bland statements put at them, but they want to engage with somebody real and actually engage with the issue. So I always would say to people, real engagement is what counts. Obviously, I find the best engagement I get with people are the people who come to see me physically or ring me on the phone, people in my constituency or from around the country, but who engage with me and engage in a debate and go into the complexities of issues, because often the person who's sending you the rote email has a black and white view on whatever issue they're espousing and cannot tolerate or see anybody else's view and don't want to engage in a real debate on the issue. Therefore, my view is personal contact. And it doesn't have to be huge numbers of people. I keep telling people who are fighting for causes, and I espouse causes that there wouldn't be huge numbers in favour of. And I say what determines what causes I espouse is not the volume, not necessarily the popularity of the cause, but the worthiness of the cause in its own objective right. So if you come to me, even if you're representing a tiny minority, and you have a cause or a point of view that's worthy of consideration, I'd engage. And what I judge it on is my intellectual recognition as to its validity. Otherwise, it's total dominance by the dominant groups. You never take minority and diversity in modern Ireland, and we get preached at every day about it. But some of the people that preach that seem to only want inclusivity as long as the inclusivity agrees with their predetermined views.
Indeed. But I'm aware I have taken a little bit more time of yours than I had originally contracted to do so. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Éamon Ó Cuiv, for joining us. I'd like to thank our viewers. I'd like to say, if you'd like to press the button to subscribe, so you'll see that there are, when we have more material coming up, you'll be advised. We're launching into some very important campaigns now, and we need your help. So if you can click on the donate button, anything you can afford to give will be most appreciated and will be a help. So again, I'd like to thank Éamon Ó Cuiv for joining us. And in these interesting and difficult times, I'd like to wish you all to stay safe and be well. Slán agus beannacht.